Veel soldaten vrijwillig deel aan experimenten met onder andere mosterdgas. Pas nu, 51 jaar later, komen de fatale gevolgen van deze chemische stoffen aan het licht. In het Engelse testcentrum Porton wordt de invloed van dergelijke gassen op het functioneren van het lichaam onderzocht.
This is the face of modern warfare, a human trial in one of the most secret government research establishments in Britain. Tonight, for the first time, we tell the true story of the human guinea pigs of Porton Down.
I assume it was a doctor or a scientist before we actually undertook the trial. He assured us that the nerve gas that we were going to be exposed to, the amount would be so minute it wouldn't harm a mouse. Well, now, 55, I'm a 16.5 stone mouse, and I think I've been harmed.
1, I'm impotent. 2, I'm sterile. 3, I've got high blood pressure. 4, I'm allergic to penicillin. 5, I've got a much enlarged heart. There are signs of emphysema in my lungs.
Your head was bursting, your lungs were bursting. You couldn't stand, you're fallen, paralyzed, all manner of things. It was horrendous what we went through. Horrendous.
No one saw it coming, and even if they had, there was nothing they could do. The consequences of the terrible chemical cocktail which Saddam Hussein unleashed 6 years ago on the Kurdish people of Halabja were both hideous and indiscriminate. Hydrogen cyanide, mustard gas, and the nerve agents tabun and sarin brought a terrible death to men, women, and children without distinction. Yet the research which gave birth to these weapons happened not in Baghdad, but in the laboratories of the West. Chemical warfare came of age in World War I as the first deadly mists of German mustard gas, phosgene and chlorine drifted across the trenches of Ypres. Britain and her allies responded by producing chemical weapons of their own and using them.
Britain has been in it since the year dot. Britain is the country with the oldest and longest continuous tradition of involvement in chemical weaponry, chemical warfare research. There's a lot of expertise in this country.
For nearly 80 years, that expertise has been based here. Porton Down has a proud record in chemical protection and defence, but here too have been developed the agents themselves. Decades of research into new and ever more deadly weapons of chemical and biological war. And as each agent and antidote were developed, so they had to be tested, firstly on animals, but ultimately on human beings. Harry Hogg was sent to Porton Down during World War II. He thought it was for chemical weapons training. He found himself in a gas chamber.
There was no ventilation, no windows, and a thick door, of course, with a peephole. Can't remember if it was an officer or not, but he put this canister on the floor, and he told us that no man would be let out until everyone was on their hands and knees. Now, he released the gas from this canister, and of course, we was choking, our lungs were bursting, our head was bursting, and it was horrendous. And we're scrambling about, we're head at the door, trying to get air from the door. He still wouldn't open the door. It seemed like eternity. He eventually opened the door and we tumbled out. Just, oh dear God. Tumbled out, just. One man in particular was eating the grass just like an animal. He was just out of his mind.
Harry Hogg has never spoken out before. Despite 50 years of ill health, he has felt bound by the Official Secrets Act. It's a silence the government encourages. Most official records are made public after 30 years, but almost everything relating to chemical warfare is still classified. But a few documents can be found, hidden among the millions of papers in the Public Records Office. These documents tell of more than 50 years of close collaboration with the United States. A collaboration which brought into being some of the most terrifying and indiscriminate weapons in human history. But they tell another story too, of the thousands of human guinea pigs which made that program possible. The secret victims of America and Britain's chemical warriors.
Hier wird ein Tröpfchen los.
The world was horrified to learn of Nazi experiments on human beings, like this mustard gas test.
Eine Blase. Nach 24
But the German experiments were not the only ones.
Then we had our first gas test, the real McCoy in a gas chamber.
In America too, young conscripts were recruited for mustard gas tests, often in locked gas chambers. Some were threatened with imprisonment if they refused, young men like Russell O'Berry.
The chamber was real small. It was sort of terrifying at first to go in there. It was extremely warm in there, up in the 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was crowded. I began to burn almost immediately. I didn't vomit in my mask like some of them did in there, but I did vomit once I came out of the gas chamber. I went in 4 different days. By the 4th day, I began to blister quite bad around my right eye, my chest area, and of course my lower extremities.
From the First World War, the scientists knew that mustard gas can damage the lungs irreversibly, but they never told the volunteers. Today, we know of another effect. It can cause cancer.
I've had a number of skin cancers removed from my body, and I stayed blind in my right eye from it for nearly 40 years. I've had at least 20 growths removed from my colon, and I got 35% of my lungs left. I've been told by my pulmonary doctor that the lower part of my lungs are like stone from the mustard gas.
But some of the most disturbing tests were being done not by the United States, but by Britain.
Volunteers arrive at the station in batches of approximately 50 at a time.
A series of wartime documents, still officially secret, describes a program of experiments conducted on young Australian volunteers by scientists from Porton down. To test the effects of mustard gas in hot climates, hundreds of recruits were sent into gas chambers and repeatedly exposed to concentrated doses of the gas. But the horrifying results served another purpose. Porton wanted to see how long soldiers could fight for, so the badly burnt men were sent over assault courses till they could take no more. It became known as manbreak.
They really forced these individuals to see just how far they could go before they broke. Would someone be so poisoned that they would have to be hospitalized? Or would it be a degree of disability that meant that they couldn't walk, but they could still man a machine gun in a defensive position?
The Porton down documents describe the results dispassionately.
7 hours after exposure, there was severe nausea. At 24 hours, general erythema of the whole body. The penis, scrotum, and popliteal fossae were edematous. He was unable to walk because of pain in the scrotum. By day 17, complete destruction of the epithelium over the whole organ, thin greyish sloughs over the foreskin and glands.
It was quite clear that these individuals weren't fully informed about the effects that the mustard gas would have on them. They were far more disabled than they were ever led to believe would happen.
But if the mustard gas test must be looked at in the context of war, what happened when peace broke out? As the war ended, the scale of Nazi crimes against humanity became clear. Over 18 million people had died in the concentration camps of the Reich, killed by torture, beatings, starvation, and above all by chemicals, Zyklon B, cyanide gas. But what has never before been revealed is that Britain had a specific interest in the extermination camps. Liberating Allied troops, outraged by what they found, stood by as former victims took revenge on their Nazi persecutors. But unknown to those troops, they were closely followed by a man with a rather different mission, a man from Porton Down. Major D.C.Evans was sent to obtain technical details of the extermination gas Zyklon B. But it wasn't easy.
Considerable time was spent trying to discover reliable data to calculate what concentrations of Zyklon were used for the extermination. It would appear, however, that no controlled experiments were carried out on a scientific basis. The chief object was to kill the victims as quickly as possible so as to make room for the next batch.
Given this lack of scientific precision, Major Evans tried his own deductions.
Several witnesses have given measurements of the size of the gas chambers with which they were acquainted, whilst others have stated the approximate numbers of Zyklon B canisters required for the extermination of given numbers of victims. Unfortunately, however, there were 3 sizes of Zyklon tins.
But Evans' report reveals that he also had a further mission. In the aftermath of war, it became clear that Germany had invented a brand new chemical weapon, nerve gas. It was more lethal than anything that had gone before, and the British wanted it.
Nerve gas acts by poisoning the message that goes from nerves to muscles, and what it does is essentially paralyze the muscles. If someone is exposed, they will have a tightness in their throat, and they might have sort of feeling of tightness in their chest. And it would then progress to the person feeling very weak, and then collapsing because their muscle coordination will have gone, and they may develop convulsions at that point, become unconscious, and then will die. They die really very quickly if you get exposed to a lethal dose of nerve gas. Death can occur within a matter of minutes, and it's from asphyxiation. The person just can't breathe.
Nerve gases were a pretty amazing new type of chemical warfare agent. This opened up new possibilities which would change the whole picture of chemical weapons and the value of these things. The quest for information of all types, pressures to acquire it quickly, must have been intense.
Just how intense is clear from the report that Evans sent his superiors back home. The British didn't just want stocks of this new weapon, they wanted to know exactly how it worked. It was thought the Nazis might have done experiments on people in concentration camps, and Evans tried to get the results.
It is thought highly probable that such experiments would have been carried out, and the results might provide invaluable data as to the lethal concentrations for man.
These guys are in the business of sucking up all there was to know about the march of German science and technology during World War II. Human experimentation on human subjects. It's an appalling thought that that sort of knowledge was being sought for, and presumably with an idea to using it.
Evans believed a Nazi scientist called Karl Wimmer had performed nerve gas experiments on humans.
I asked that he be arrested at once. He would be well worth interrogating. Wimmer is probably one of the few surviving individuals who might be able to provide such information.
But Wimmer was never brought to trial. There's no further mention of him in British records, and his contribution to Porton, if any, is undisclosed.
There are many layers of secrecy in this whole chemical biological warfare world. this type of information would be under one of the most deepest layers of secrecy. Presumably that's where it still is.
However it was obtained, we know that German nerve gas knowledge and expertise did find their way back to Britain. Production and development of the new G agents were now in Allied hands. This is the abandoned site of Nancycook. It was to here on the coast of Cornwall that Britain brought nerve gas manufacturing equipment that it had confiscated from the Germans as war booty. And it was here behind these fences, amid the greatest secrecy, that Britain set up its own nerve gas production plant. The project was so sensitive that even the local men employed in its construction were kept in the dark.
They wouldn't tell us what the work was, just said it would be varied and interesting, but in engineering. We started to build the plant, which was for the production of nerve gas, still not knowing what the place was for. A lot of the items in the plant were parts of a chemical plant which Germany had used to produce nerve gas. There was absolute secrecy. It must have been one of the best kept secrets in the country. They probably didn't want other countries to know they were engaged on producing nerve gas. America knew, of course, because we worked in collaboration with the Americans.
GD is one of hundreds of nerve gases. All of them kill as GD kills, very quickly.
Britain cooperated closely with America on the G-Agent program. Previously secret film and documents reveal a free exchange of research and information, but when it came to informing its own troops, the United Kingdom was more circumspect.
We have a volunteer here to show you the effects of a mild trace of nerve gas. Now this man is showing essentially the mild effects. Tightness of the chest and throat, and having great difficulty in breathing. You'll have a running nose.
Jerry Ashton was 20 and in the RAF when he went to Porton Down.
I didn't know what a nerve gas was in those days. It was fairly new then. As far as I was concerned, it was just a gas. I went into this gas chamber, which had an airlock. I was told to just walk around normally and to breathe normally. I did that.
And now I'd like to show you the eye symptoms. Notice how small the pupils of his eyes have become.
Then, at the end of the 3 minutes, I was taken out. And by the time I got back to my billet, I was almost blind. Everything was like shadows. This lasted for 2 or 3 days, like that, where I was just groping around. When I began to be able to see a bit better, I went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror at my eyes. And the pupils of my eyes, instead of being round, had actually turned kidney-shaped, which I thought was most unusual.
And so the young recruits continued to arrive at Porton, up to 10 a week, all secure in the faith that they would not be harmed. That trust was to be betrayed. In 1953, a young conscripted airman was part of another group brought here for a series of tests on chemical agents. Leading aircraftman Ronald Madison was just 20 years old, and he was to die in agony from nerve gas poisoning. It's 40 years since Ronald Madison died of nerve gas poisoning at Porton Down, yet the details are still secret.
Everybody had to keep quiet about it. Nobody could get to know anything about it. It was just a load of secrecy.
Madison grew up in the town of Consett, County Durham.
Ronnie was a quiet boy. I don't think he would harm a fly. He was a nice, reserved kind of boy.
Volunteers for Porton got £1 a test, but for Madison, stationed in Northern Ireland, there was another inducement.
Ronnie was homesick, and he wanted to come home. So that was the reason he volunteered so that he could get some leave to come home.
Ronnie was of the opinion that what he was volunteering for was a mild, to have some medical treatment, presumably for a cure for the common cold, for influenza, or something similar to that. And it was a holiday camp he was going to.
In fact, though he didn't know it, Madison had volunteered to become part of a Porton research program into nerve gas toxicity.
The great danger of nerve gas is it kills very quickly, and to an onlooker, the appearance of a casualty prior to death can be most unpleasant. Nerve gas...
The scientists at Porton already knew that nerve gas was deadly when inhaled.
The liquid is absorbed through the skin.
But now they wanted to do tests on skin. Documents in our possession show that Madison had 200 milligrams of the nerve agent GB applied on a patch to his skin. We understand that the agent was then covered to prevent evaporation.
You have seen the effects of a mild dose of nerve gas, and now I'd like you to see the effects of a more severe dose. The casualty suffers muscular twitching. Severe convulsions follow. After the convulsions, paralysis begins in most of the muscles throughout the body. The breathing stops. Shortly after, the heart stops, and death follows.
A large percutaneous dose went straight into the guy. And he started suffering acute symptoms really very quickly, with 4 doctors standing around him, unable to retrieve him at all. It's been an hideous and awful case.
Madison's inquest was held in secret. Only his father was allowed to attend.
Ronnie's father, all he would say was he was sworn to secrecy, and he couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't tell his own, Ronnie's mother. It was a complete and utter wall of silence. And it has been a wall of silence for 40 years.
An inquiry concluded that Ronald Madison was unusually sensitive to nerve gas. Yet it also recommended that in future no more than 5 milligrams should be used in skin tests. Madison had had 200.
Some individuals would have been more sensitive to nerve agents. And it worries me that these individuals weren't pulled out very early on. But Madison was exposed to an amount that was really quite considerable, and he died as a result.
We know from documents in the Public Record Office that Madison's death was just one of 7 cases of severe nerve gas poisoning in Porton around that time. And despite the recommendations of the Madison inquiry, there were more mishaps to come. The antidote to nerve gas is called atropine, and to test it, Porton once again exposed human subjects to nerve agent. One of them was John Nelson.
As we're going into the gas chamber, the person who was the orderly jabbed the needle through into the muscle. We were told via a loudspeaker to remove our gas masks, which we did. And the last thing I remember was we felt like a clamp being sprung round my temples and round my chest. And I don't remember anything after that. Next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed.
Nelson was given no warning he was about to be treated with nerve gas.
At no time were we ever told, either before or after the experiments were carried out, what agents were used, what the results of the experiments were, and what effects, if any, we would suffer at a later date.
I think that's a dreadful state of affairs. I think that if you're asking someone to take part in a study that involves an agent that we know is lethal, that could kill them, they have to be told. It's just unethical to do anything otherwise.
Of course, that kind of honesty would hardly encourage recruits. Instead, the Ministry of Defence seemed happy to push the image of Porton down as some sort of holiday camp.
Basically, the requirement is for parties of 12 male volunteers who are physically fit to come to Porton for a fortnight.
Quarters were very nice compared to the barrack rooms that we had in those days as well. because army barrack rooms in the 50s, 60s, etc. were extremely bleak.
Upstairs in the club, there is a billiard table and table tennis.
And in case that wasn't incentive enough, Porton held out another, more tantalising inducement.
But unfortunately, volunteers from the women's services cannot be accepted for administrative, amongst other reasons. There are frequent bus services into Salisbury for those who like urban as opposed to rural nightlife.
Among those recruits was a young man called Mick Roach.
We were told that we were to go into these cubicles, and in them was like an oxygen mask. Place that on our heads, and one of the technicians carefully checked the fitting, and then left. And then over a loudspeaker came, "We are now going to administer the dose. Please inhale naturally." And we breathed in for a few times. All of us felt a tightening of the chest and the lungs, some for a few seconds, some for a minute or two, and then it wore off.
No one knows precisely the long-term effects of low doses of nerve gas. Porton Down denies any ill effects, but others argue that damage may take many years to appear. Mick Roach says it was 20 years before his symptoms developed.
I had blood pressure that was absolutely astronomical. The nurses and the doctors said, "At that pressure, your head should explode." And then when I came out of hospital and went back to my own doctor, he wanted to prescribe a long-term treatment. And he just casually remarked, had I ever been exposed to a dangerous chemical in working environment? And I said, I can do better than that, Doc. I attended Porton Down as a human guinea pig for gas testing.
That gas was manufactured here at Nanskuk in Cornwall, the plant set up by Porton Down after the war. And as the men working there discovered, that too was a dangerous place. Tom Griffiths was one of them.
I'd gone into the cubicle where I was to do this job with a technical assistant who advised me that I had no need to wear protective clothing because the cubicle was not in use. And we were both seized with a fit of coughing. I saw a drop of liquid coming out from between the two flanges. I knew what that was. It had to be nerve gas. So I came down the ladder as fast as I could, told the other chap to get out quick. And I noticed there was a damp patch on the floor where this nerve gas had been leaking over the weekend. So I came out, shut the door, and we could hardly breathe, restriction to the chest. And the eyesight was severely affected. The pupils shrunk down to pinpoints.
Tom is now chronically disabled and must take 13 tablets a day, sometimes more. In his case, a long fight finally brought official recognition that exposure to nerve gas damaged his health, although the MOD denies him compensation. His symptoms are strikingly similar to those of many Porton volunteers: breathlessness, fainting fits, muscle spasms, and memory loss. Tom Griffiths is a loyal and principled man. When he was told by his country to keep his work secret, he did so, even from his wife. It was 12 years after the accident before he told her.
I couldn't work out really why somebody that was always so upstanding and open and everything could have kept a secret like that from me for 12 years. And then somebody spring it on me.
I couldn't tell Eileen what my work was due to the Official Secrets Act. In fact, I couldn't tell anybody. I'd have liked to have shared my work experiences with her, but I just felt I couldn't. I didn't tell anybody, not even my doctor.
Eileen was shocked by Tom's work, despite his conviction that Britain's nerve gas had acted as a deterrent to others.
Well, we overcame our difference of opinion, and although when I see the photographs of the Iranian children and people and what nerve gas did to them, I find it very hard to come to terms that Tommy, of all people, should have had any part of it. I don't suppose the world will ever be rid of it now because they don't know how to get rid of it. So we're stuck with it, aren't we?
The crime at Halabja lent new urgency to the search for a way to outlaw chemical warfare forever. Last year, 130 nations met to discuss a chemical weapons convention, the first real attempt to rid the world of these weapons since Geneva in 1925. The stakes are high.
If this convention fails to enter into force, we will see in the remainder of the 1990s a proliferation of chemical weapons. We have 20 to 25 countries today that are of concern. They are of concern either because they have chemical weapons or because they are trying to get them. That number could grow easily.
Britain, with her long involvement, is key to the success of the convention. But there's a problem. A condition of the treaty is that every supporting nation must prepare a full declaration describing their chemical warfare program for the past 50 years. The treaty demands absolute honesty from all governments.
If states are not candid in their declarations, the trust which other states have in the whole system of the chemical treaty will be weakened. The honesty with which individual countries, therefore, put forward their data is, it seems to me, pretty crucial to the future success of this disarmament effort.
And no one has a longer and fuller history than Britain.
You could very well say that.
But will Britain be honest? On the face of it, we have little to hide. The government insists Britain gave up both its chemical weapons and Porton Down's offensive research brief 4 decades ago. That decision was taken by the Cabinet in 1956. Yet for some reason, the minutes of that meeting were still kept secret nearly 40 years later. But why? Why should the details of a decision over which you might expect the government to feel justifiably proud be kept hidden amongst the millions of restricted documents in this archive? Certainly Porton Down seem in little doubt about the effect it had on their work.
The United Kingdom abandoned all offensive chemical and biological weapons work in the late 1950s. The effect on Porton was to cause our work to be wholly concerned with the provision of effective protective measures for the British Armed Forces against the threat of chemical or biological weapons. And the result of that is that we are wholly concerned with the saving of lives.
But has that always been true? Porton maintains that since 1956, volunteers have been tested purely as part of a defensive program, research which played a vital role in protecting troops in the Gulf War. But America, Britain's closest ally in the Gulf, always had an offensive chemical weapons program. And as we can reveal, Britain's cooperation with America over chemical warfare runs deeper than has ever been admitted before. This is Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, Porton Down's transatlantic twin and home since 1917 to America's chemical and biological program. Together, these establishments, Edgewood and Porton Down, represent the focus for one of the closest and most enduring collaborations in the history of the Transatlantic Alliance.
Well, there was a very close relationship. Reports were freely interchanged. There were many visits. The personal relationship between the senior members and even the junior members of the Edgewood staff and the Porton staff were very close and very intimate.
V agent. A single drop on the skin can cause casualties.
This US Army film, kept secret until now, shows the devastating result of that transatlantic alliance. V agents were the chemical weapon of the future, a range of nerve gases far more deadly than G, and they were invented by Britain. ICI had discovered the formula for V agents in the early 50s and passed it on to Porton. Within months, Porton scientists had handed this secret new weapon to the chemical warriors of Edgewood, and it quickly took pride of place in the US stockpile.
The importance of the V agents is that they poison through the skin. So If you want to be protected from a V agent, you have to have complete body protection from head to toe. And if you don't have a protective suit and you're just wearing a gas mask and you're exposed to a V agent, you will die because the V agent gets through the skin into the bloodstream and poisons the nervous system.
Just one drop of VX nerve gas can kill, and within a few years the States had manufactured a small ocean of the stuff. But in 1956, as America began VX production, Britain, we are told, gave up its offensive program for good. The evidence suggests otherwise.
This document has never been seen before. It's a report of a joint US, UK, Australian conference on chemical-biological warfare held in 1957, 1 year after Britain gave up offensive research. Remarkably, given its date, it's a report by a body known as the Offensive Evaluation Committee, and it draws particular attention to one of the conference's key conclusions.
V-agent spray shows considerable promise in the attack of personnel, in the open or in open trenches, and for ground contamination. Research and development effort in all three countries should be expedited, with a view to their incorporation into the weapons systems.
In July 1963, 7 years after the government claims it stopped offensive work, the Offensive Evaluation Committee met yet again. The then director of Porton, E.E. Haddon, said the US had selected VX as their standard agent, and that the UK, which was examining other variants, would probably be under pressure to accept VX. If offensive research was supposed to stop after '56, why did a committee called the Offensive Evaluation Committee continue to meet for many years afterwards?
I'm not aware that it did meet after it. I'm sorry, I have no information on that. As far as I'm concerned, I'm aware that the United Kingdom made the decision to abandon offensive chemical weapons in the late 1950s.
In fact, we know from other previously unpublished documents that Porton was engaged in consistently aggressive research. One 1962 document refers to the relentless search for yet more deadly agents.
Nerve agents are being sought which have the chemical and physical properties likely to make them more effective agents than GB or VX. For example, compounds which may penetrate human skin more rapidly.
This document is particularly significant because as recently as January of this year, Parliament was told by the director of Porton Down in a formal written reply,
"Our records do not indicate that any tests or studies have been carried out to assess a nerve agent which penetrates the skin and clothing quicker than the G agents and VX."
You've addressed this question. You've obviously been to your records. Your records show, because we have copies of them, that you had done that, and you told Parliament that you hadn't.
We were not aware of the statement that you have just read out. I think you have to realise that when you answer a parliamentary question, you do your absolute best to provide an accurate and honest answer. And we do everything possible, but we cannot go and sit for weeks ploughing through files in the hope of finding a scrap of information such as you just read out.
In fact, work on nerve agents, as the records show, was central to Porton's activities. And it is precisely on the accurate reporting of those activities that the success of the chemical convention depends.
The statement repeated many times is that Britain ceased its offensive work, moved out of chemical weapons programs in the late 1950s. Now, we see from these papers that actually Britain was looking at the next generation of V-agent nerve gases that could come along after the ones which were already in production at that very time in the United States. This certainly does not square with statements that we were not contemplating offensive work after the late 1950s. Manifestly not.
If you are, perhaps inadvertently, misleading Parliament, telling them a factual untruth, isn't there a danger that the rest of the world will not be able to trust Britain's accounting in all respects?
I think you're being quite inaccurate. I think the United Kingdom has shown the way on accurate reporting of past programs. And I do not accept that I, in any way, misleading Parliament. I think that is an unwarranted slur, and I think you should appreciate that we do our level best to provide a most honest and comprehensive answer to any parliamentary question.
Dr. Pearson subsequently admitted in a letter placed in the Commons Library that his original statement was wrong. But he says Porton was only trying to invent a new agent so they could produce the antidote in case an aggressor also invented the agent. For 40 years, the government has insisted it gave up offensive research in 1956. But as the documents show, that claim just doesn't stand up.
The Chemical Convention requires a whole new ethos, a whole new attitude to the way in which we view chemical biological warfare. It requires an attitude of openness, the very opposite of the attitude displayed by this type of document, but that's the characteristic of chemical biological warfare in the 50s and 60s. People were extremely secretive about it, furtive, distorting the public record, it now turns out. If this treaty is going to survive, that attitude, of course, has to change totally.
But will it change? The few files released so far are all more than 3 decades old, and they're embarrassing enough. What happened after 1963? Well, the documents, such as they are, dry up completely, and Britain's 30-year secrecy rule imposes a complete blackout. The key to what happened next lies in Britain's continuing collaboration with America, a country awash with chemical weapons and ready to use them.
The cooperation between the U.S. and UK continued, looking at new chemicals that might be found on a battlefield, looking at their chemistry, looking at the properties, toxicities, volatilities, all of these factors in developing defensive equipment.
So that while Britain continued to do its work on defensive work, the information which it gained, which might be useful to the US offensive program, was transferred to the US.
That's correct.
Would the knowledge gained in the research for new potential threats be exchanged with America, which would of course allow them to develop it into a weapon?
At an appropriate point in time, yes.
And that exchange of information would continue?
Yes.
So scientists from Porton would often come here to Edgewood, bringing with them the fruits of their research. And here, all too often, despite Britain's commitment to a defensive-only posture, that research was converted to the development of weapons of war. Weapons like these. This footage, never before seen on television, shows a field test of live nerve gas shells. The enemy on this occasion are goats, and though he may not have felt it, the goat in the gas mask is the lucky one. No one has kept count of the number of animals used and discarded in the development of chemical warfare. But the British government hasn't even admitted how many humans have been tested. We have established that in the 15 years up to 1959 alone, 7,000 volunteers were tested at Porton, over a third of those with nerve gas. That's more than America has tested since the Second World War. In the United States, all tests using nerve gas on humans stopped 20 years ago. They have not stopped at Porton. Porton says that for the past 3 years, their tests have been monitored by an independent ethics committee. They insist that all tests, past and present, are completely safe, so safe that there is no need for any health checks on volunteers after they leave. The fact is that no one yet knows just what long-term damage the nerve agents may cause, but many experts are worried.
I don't believe that Porton can claim that there are no long-term effects of exposure to nerve agents if there are no long-term follow-up studies of people who are exposed to those same agents. They can't make the claim that there are no effects without the study.
But Porton rejects the need for any such follow-up tests.
We are unaware of any long-term harm that has been associated with any of these volunteers. And several volunteers have come back more than once, and there's been no indication of any long-term harm to any of those volunteers.
How systematic a system of medical follow-up do you run? Do you keep records of all your volunteers and, say, recall them once a year? Do you keep regular contact with them?
There is no evidence to suggest that there is a need to call back volunteers on a regular basis.
But surely there will be no evidence until you call them back and find out if these new agents do have a long-term effect.
But you could argue that you should call back people who've been exposed to, say, passive smoking and see if that's got effects on them.
Indeed, that's done at great length these days.
It's the question of what is a best and appropriate use of resources, and one endeavours to use resources to the best effect to ensure that our armed forces have effective protective measures. There are a lot of things that you could carry out research on, but it would be wasting the government's money if you put effort into things that have little prospect of any benefit to those concerned.
Volunteers who are concerned about their health have tried to help themselves.
I went to my GP and explained the situation to him. He wrote to the MOD. They wrote back denying that I'd ever been to Porton Down at all. I said, all right, will you write to them once more? I did do. This time the reply was that yes, I had been to Porton Down, and they admitted it, but that the experiments as I took part in were of a very innocuous nature. That's a quote, actually, from the letter.
Jerry Ashton, in common with other volunteers, has still not seen his records.
I think if there's the slightest reason to suppose that these people could be suffering some long-term ill effect, then yes, these people really ought to know what they've been through in the past.
In America, too, men like Russ O'Berry spent years fighting for access to their records. Eventually, they succeeded.
The burden of proof was on me, since they told me I had no records. So finally, I wrote. We have a Freedom of Information Act here. I don't know why you have it in Great Britain or not, but you should. I wrote to the Freedom of Information Act. They sent me my records. I have them here now. I'd like for you to see them. I was assigned a number. I was 133. Here are the papers. But here are the dates, the time that I went into the chambers, the examination afterwards. Once I received these papers, I knew that I could get my benefits then. But this was the only thing that I could get my benefits on, the proof, and I had the proof.
America eventually launched an official inquiry into the after effects of its human testing program, and veterans like O'Berry are getting compensation. But no such thing is happening in Britain. Here, volunteers find the Official Secrets Act blocks their every move.
My rights as a human being has been abused and betrayed. I feel that the secrecy under which these trials are conducted is something that shouldn't happen in a civilized society.
Many of these volunteers are frightened by the Official Secret Act. The only option they have got is to disregard the Official Secret Act and come out wherever possible and say, look, this happened to me. These are the effects. Investigate them, please. Prove if they are right or wrong. And if they are wrong, recompense us, recognize the fact, and pension us off. Is that asking too much?
"40 years on, the family of Ronnie Madison are asking for even less. All they want is the truth.
The authorities should release any information at all. That's their dues, as far as I'm concerned. Something down the line, whatever, had gone wrong. But nobody ever got to know what the truth was. And I think it should come out. I think it should be told. It should have been done years ago, though. Years ago.